Good evening. Last time we talked about the Grosse Fuge, which Stravinsky said was forever modern. Now we're going to talk about music by Rachmaninoff, which Stravinsky said was forever old-fashioned. He didn't actually say it in so many words, but they did have a lot of problems. Stravinsky didn't want to be on the same programs with Rachmaninoff just because they were both Russian. But they finally met in Hollywood, of course. So everybody was escaping to Hollywood. And they met because Vera Stravinsky went to the same farmer's market as Arthur Rubinstein and Mrs. Rachmaninoff. So they all got together for dinner. And at first it was very difficult, and Rubinstein wrote in his diary that he didn't think these two composers could possibly have anything to talk about. And eventually, 3 vodkas later, they had plenty to talk about, mostly royalties and how the Soviet Union prevented them from getting any royalties. And just as an update, royalties are still a situation because of live streaming and Spotify and Qobuz and all those, and it's suddenly just changing right now that the classical music world has not given up, but they've joined the team, and everything is going to be listed, you're not going to see it this way, but as a song, won't say song, but in other words, a piece that's 4 movements will be 4 pieces, because that's the only way to collect royalties, because the idea of movements is out the window. Okay, now to Rachmaninoff. Musicians call Rachmaninoff rock. I don't know if you know that. There's Tchaik, rock, Shasti. And there's a website where some Russian musician is very angry about this and tells everybody how to pronounce the names correctly. Have you seen this? It's not worth watching. But rock, pianists will say, I'm playing rock 3. That's the 3rd piano concerto, or rock 2. But what people don't realize is that the piece that connected Tchaikovsky and Rachmaninoff, which this trio is, the variation movement is based on, is called the rock. And it's not R-A-C-H. It's actually not R-O-C-K because it's in Russian. But it means the rock. And I will get back to that. That's like a flash forward. I'll get right back to the rock in just a moment. But I want to say something about the relationship between Tchaikovsky and Rachmaninoff because it's important to this piece. In 1989, well, I first should say at age 12, Rachmaninoff left St. Petersburg and came to Moscow Conservatory, and he was studying with his cousin Siloty, and he idolized Rachmaninoff, as many young composers did at the time. And he was lucky enough that his exam in 1889, the conservatory exam, required a 4-part harmonization of a tune by Haydn, which would have been fairly easy for him, and a prelude that had to have a pedal point on the dominant and the tonic. Now, believe me, if that sounds complex, don't worry, it's incredibly easy to do that, and he passed very well. But what's more important is that they gave him a 5+, which is the highest grade, but Tchaikovsky stood up and went over to the 5+ and put a plus on top, a plus on the side, and a plus on the bottom. So it was 5++++. And he made it very well known at concerts when there was a piece by Rachmaninoff, who was a teenager at the time, that Tchaikovsky would lean out of the balcony where everyone could see him and scream bravo and applaud because he thought he was such a genius. And they became friends. And then in 1893, there was a little meeting at Taneev's house, who was the composition teacher of Rachmaninoff. And there, Rachmaninoff played on the piano his piece, The Rock. I told you it would come back. And The Rock, actually, it's an interesting title. I'll explain it in a moment. And Tchaikovsky thought it was a great piece. And he decided he wanted to conduct the premiere, because this was just the piano version, that he would conduct it in 1894 at an important concert. He also intended to conduct Aleko, an opera that he had heard, a student opera of Rachmaninoff's. So Rachmaninoff was beside himself he was ecstatic. And then, of course, in 1893, just a few months later, Tchaikovsky died. I have a book at home that I was going to bring in, but you can just imagine, it's a big, heavy book. That's why it's still in my house, which is an encyclopedia that was printed in 1893. An American music encyclopedia, but it covers the world, sort of. And On the article about Tchaikovsky, he's still alive at the end, but then there's a stamp that says, as this goes to print, Professor Tchaikovsky has died. So I thought, this is something. I was looking at it in a rare bookstore, and the owner said to me, "Is that worth something, that book?" I said, "I know, it's so out of date." And I got a very good deal on it. So what does the rock mean? Well, first I have to say, so after he died, the piece we're going to hear is that Rachmaninoff took this piece, the rock, because he knew it was going to be conducted by Tchaikovsky, and that he said he liked it so much, and there was a particular theme that he liked. And he wrote the trio that you're going to hear, which is an elegy to Tchaikovsky. And Tchaikovsky had already written his elegy trio for Nikolai Rubinstein. So this was a tradition. And Rachmaninoff modeled his trio structurally in some ways on the Tchaikovsky, especially having variations, which is what we're going to look at in the second movement. Rachmaninoff wrote that he was thinking of his song, "No, Do Not Leave," when he wrote the first movement. And then he wrote also in this letter about writing this trio, "I was in torment the whole time and sick in my soul. During the composition of the trio, all my thoughts, feelings, and energy belong to that song." Now the rock, what does it mean? The reason I'm going to read this little passage to you is it's a very musical image from a story by Anton Chekhov. Now if you look this up, remember you can always get true but wrong answers on the internet. So if you look it up, it'll tell you it's based on a line of a poem by Lermontov. But it's not. The line by Lermontov is quoted by Chekhov at the beginning of the story. It's based on the story. So you just have to read to the bottom of things, okay? So here's the paragraph, the last paragraph of the story by Chekhov. And of course, Chekhov and Rachmaninoff got to know each other. He stood for a long while as though rooted to the spot, gazing at the tracks left by the sled runners. The snowflakes greedily settled on his hair, his beard, his shoulders. Soon the track of the runners had vanished, and he himself, covered with snow, began to look like a white rock. But still his eyes kept seeking something in the clouds of snow. And that's the end of the story. Even though you don't know the story, it's a great ending because it doesn't end, it leaves you in this. Now, to me, that is a pedal point. Follow me? A pedal point, remember, I say remember, if you can remember it, go ahead. A pedal point is a tone, like on an organ, if you put your foot on an organ pedal, that stays there while everything else moves around it. It's one of the most common devices in music, and actually not just Western music, in folk music from everywhere in the world. This also can be called a drone, something that stays there while other things move around it. A pedal point is a little different than a drone because it has to fit with the harmonic structure of the piece as opposed to being there all the time, like on a bagpipe. But it's similar. And this person who is covered in snow and looking out and thinking that he's still seeing something, but he doesn't know what, is like a pedal point, and there are many pedal points in this piece, which we'll hear. Now, before we hear the actual music, here is some music from the rock, pardon-moi. This is for orchestra, and he played it on the piano, so I just wrote out a little bit of where the theme comes in the orchestra piece, The Rock. Very different from the trio, completely different. So let's hear the theme as he wrote it, solo piano, hear the theme as he wrote it in the trio in memory of Rachmaninoff. Now, it's kind of like a Russian folk song, the way he's used it. It's always an F major or modal, goes back and forth. Extremely simple. There's one strange thing about it to me. Pardon. There's only one note in that whole thing that's not diatonic. In other words, not in the key. It's a chromatic note. One change note. Just one. Now, he could have done a lot. So I'll tell you where it is. It's, does it feel weird when that comes, that C sharp? Yeah, it's a little strange. Listen to the bass. There it is, da, da, that's the note, it's a C sharp. And then it goes away, C natural, and that's it. Why did he even do it? Let's take it out. You wouldn't miss it. Let's put a few more in. I mean, he was a student, you know. I mean, he had just graduated, but right here, the B section, you know, this is ABA, this little thing. The tune, there's a B section. The B section begins like this. We could have put a C sharp in here. You like that? Why didn't he do that? He just did. He also could have done this. So the C sharp sneaks in, and I think he must have thought about it a lot. Maybe it was tormenting him. He said he was being tormented. The entire set of variations hinges on C sharps and D flats, which is the same note, you know, enharmonically, especially on a piano. It's not really the same on strings, is it? No. No. Okay. But so the very first passage that you hear after that, it has the C sharp, again, C sharp, and then it becomes a D flat. Now the C sharp's up here. So everything starts to be about C sharp sneaking in or D flat sneaking in, the harmonies changing around C sharp and D flat. Let's hear some of this, this first variation. And I don't know if I want to, Gilles, I don't know if I want to ask you to bring out the C sharp, but I will. Okay, and I already did, and you already are going to do it. So think about your C sharp section when it comes as a note. Just, well, let's go a little further maybe.
Second part?
Yeah. Well, no, start at the beginning of the variation and I'll stop you. Wait. I forgot to tell you, the tune, dee-da-da-da-da, is a C sharp already, dee-da-da. The whole tune has been changed. So that little C sharp that's right there has already changed the inflection of the melody completely. All right, sorry, go ahead. Okay, that's good. Now, if you're a musician, you heard all the C sharps and D flats. If not, you felt them. If you didn't even feel them, don't worry. It's okay, there are a lot of other things going on. So, by the way, this very Tchaikovsky and romantic music wasn't the only kind of music being written at this time at all. And I'm going to give you a few highlights of what else was being composed this year and the year before that he wrote this. So, it happened to be a really good year, 1892 here. Something's going on with your iPad. 1892 and 1893. This was 1893, this piece after Tchaikovsky died. I'm including 1892 because that was in his ear, obviously. So here's a little piece that was written in 1892. How many of you have played this? I'm not looking, so it's okay. So, Debussy was older or younger than Rachmaninoff? Don't answer. I'll just tell you. So Rachmaninoff was 19 and Debussy was 30. People often reverse that because it seems like he's later, but he's not later. So this was also written the same year as the Rock and the Trio. I'm sure you've played this too. So Brahms was 60. So Brahms was 60 and Debussy was 30. Rachmaninoff was 19 and 20. Now, who do you think wrote this? Any idea? I was just playing a fragment. Ravel. In 1893, he was 18. And he was writing this very unusual music that was quite dissonant compared to anything that was heard by, certainly by Rachmaninoff. Okay, so that's just a little perspective on how the world was changing, but not so much in Moscow. Although Moscow had a huge effect on all those French composers, Debussy and Ravel, which I'll get to later, but Debussy spent time in Moscow because he was the official, as a young man, the official pianist of the household of Nadezhda von Meck, who was the patroness of Tchaikovsky. So he was around all of that, and he brought certain ideas of harmony back to France, which bounced around and got to America, and I'll get to that too. Okay, so now let's get back to the Rachmaninoff trio. Next thing that happens is an enormous piano solo after the section that you just heard, which we are skipping a lot of it. You'll hear it later. This slow piano solo really sums up what I'm talking about in terms of C sharps and D flats. But before you hear it, here's a little harmony lesson about this kind of stuff. I think this is easy to hear and kind of important. By the way, the harmony teacher at the Moscow Conservatory was Tchaikovsky. And he wrote a book. You can still buy it. Dover put it out in English. It's very interesting because he explains all of his thoughts about harmony from a very pedantic point of view. And he continually says there's right and there's wrong unless you're really good, and then you can do whatever you want. Which is the attitude that Rachmaninoff also learned and had. Rachmaninoff often said that he couldn't stand the music of his time because he felt that composers were just trying all kinds of things without having learned the harmony they're supposed to learn first. He excused Stravinsky. He said he seemed to know what he was doing. So here's a typical harmony exercise. It still is a harmony exercise. Here's that C sharp we're talking about. I'm going to play a chord that has C sharp. Here's the F sharp minor. And I'm going to lower the bass a half step each time. And as I lower it, I'm going to come up with various harmonies that can fit. So every note, every single note there is, can have a C sharp included in its harmony. Major. Beethoven's favorite, Ravel's favorite, Debussy's favorite. Now the exercise is just to keep that C sharp there and change the chords almost randomly. Does this sound random? And if you end there like Debussy, you can work in New York. Okay. Well, restaurants. Okay, so now with bearing that in mind, let's hear this thing because you can put the music up here. I just want to say one more thing. You're going to hear the first chord has the C sharp in it, and you'll hear that chord a few times, but then you'll hear this chord in the middle, and that also has a D flat, and then you'll also hear that also has it, and it'll go back to the first chord. So he's already given you this whole thing is structured around a dominant seventh where this is the third, a dominant seventh where this is the seventh, a dominant seventh where this is the fifth. So if that sounds like higher math, don't worry, it's just where in the chord. Here it is as the fifth. 1, 3, 5. Now it's the seventh. Now it's the root. So you can move it around, and that's what he's doing. And he also lets you hear the thinking process, because you'll hear this kind of passage. In fact, you'll hear this exact passage. There's this C sharp. Now it's on the top, and you get this chord. There it is. Now it's here. Now it's here and here. So it's constantly there, or he's striving for it or moving away from it. You want to play that for us? almost like an improvisation. And it does two things. It alternates the modal, simple Russian folk song-like theme, the way he said it, with versions of C sharp and D flat, becoming very chromatic and searching. They back and forth between the two. So it's like the Russian melody, the theme from the rock, perhaps is Tchaikovsky, or a memory of Tchaikovsky. But then the tortured soul of Rachmaninoff lives in these chromatic passages. Now, I'm not saying he ever said that that's what it was, but that's what it seems like. And the chromaticism often does represent, a higher emotional state, a more complex emotional state. And the fact that the C sharp keeps returning is like that white rock, the snow covering this person. Now, what happens right after that? Let's hear how he breaks out of that, because he is an entertainer even at age 19. So, a little bit of the next part. Okay, so this goes on. You'll hear this more later. It does have some C sharps. It also has an E flat that comes, but you'll hear that later. This reminds me, though, of when he met Tolstoy. He got to meet Tolstoy. Rachmaninoff was so excited. He met everybody, and he went with Shaliapin, and the two of them entertained Tolstoy, they thought. But Tolstoy really didn't like music very much, which they found out, because he said quite a few terrible things, but the thing that sticks with me and I had to write down is he said to Rachmaninoff after he played, "Tell me, is such music needed by anybody?" Yeah, okay. Now, let's get to rehearsal 22.
Right on.
Yeah, now what you're going to hear is a continuation of that same variation, and we'll do the first ending, because there's a harmony in there that we need to listen to. Okay, great. Now, there's a chord in there. You heard this. Now, it goes by so fast. That chord was popularized many years later in Purple Haze by Jimi Hendrix. It's true, that's the chord progression. But he didn't invent it. It's a blues chord, so what is Rachmaninoff doing with that? He's not writing it like this, but he does do, and then it's gone, and here it is. You can't help it. It's there. I just wanted to mention that because there's so many crunchy dissonances in this music, and sometimes people will turn to each other listening to Rachmaninoff and say, "See, he's modern," for one chord or something like that. Now, actually, what happens next, there's a beautiful section that is all about pedal points, and I'll describe it to you a little bit. And again, think of the rock, which is what this is based on, and the idea of, what is a pedal point anyway? Does it mean something? Most composers use pedal points even more when they write religious works, partly because they're inspired by Baroque music, but why is it there? It seems that if a note stays put and everything moves it around it, it has some significance. It could be eternity, it could be faith, it could be death, it could be God, it could be an F natural. But or all of those things. So what happens here is that you get a series of pedal points that descend slowly, and when they get from F, which is the key, down to D flat, surprise, surprise, then it's done, and it goes back to the original key of F. And the last pedal point is very long. They're all like 6 bars long, but the last one is more than 12 bars long. And I sometimes wonder, looking at this music, that he's maybe thinking of the fact that Tchaikovsky liked how he wrote his pedal points and gave him a 5 plus 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 plus. So let's hear this section, yes, starting at after the double. Drops. Now listen carefully. It goes down a half step to the key of E major. Now drops again. Now we're in E flat. Now it moves to D flat. Now here comes the long pedal. Now, it's a beautiful section. It's very simple. And it really does show that, as Tchaikovsky and even more Rachmaninoff felt, that simplicity was the most difficult and important thing in composition. But by dropping each long phrase a half step, it also is a reference to an old motif for death, goes back to the Baroque period, which is a descending chromatic scale, F, E, E flat, D, D flat, C. Even to Dido and Aeneas, where there's a famous chromatic scale of death. But that last part that you just heard, the chords, there's the D flat, now it's the C sharp, and we're back to F major. Here D flat is the root, here it's a sharp fifth, here it's a third, we're back to F major. That's almost the exercise that I was doing. It's the root, it's the fifth, it's the third. So he's thinking very clearly how to recontextualize that note. And it's quite beautiful. And it also, again, refers to that, I think, that white rock of snow, which is gazing out, looking for something. Now, this is a long movement, so I'm going to go to another. There are so many great passages. Here's a simple passage where I think, again, because one of the counterpoint teachers was Tchaikovsky, that he realized he better put some counterpoint, and also Tchaikovsky did quite a lot of fugal counterpoint in his variations in memory of Rubinstein. So this is not a fugue. This is just straight ahead imitation. It's very simple, but it's also what's wonderful about it is that it's exciting, interesting music with no chromatic notes. It just stays completely purely diatonic. That's actually rather difficult to do. So let's start it at 26. You'll hear the piano starts to tune, then the cello, then the violin, and he starts to then, after playing this tune with no chromatic notes for a few bars, it becomes very chromatic and rather extraordinary. I'll just sum this up. In the same way that D flat and C sharp fit. To F, he's now in B flat, so it's an F and a G flat. In other words, he's transposing the chromaticism. He takes his time getting there, but then it's a whopper. Okay. Okay, great. You know, if it sounds like anybody, to me it sounds a little bit less like Tchaikovsky than Fauré. And the connections make sense. You know, because Tchaikovsky Rachmaninoff was trying to push his own personality somehow to not be imitating Tchaikovsky. And he didn't imitate Tchaikovsky. And his own personality made him look at certain kinds of harmonies that were actually what Fauré was also doing. I don't think he knew any Fauré, though. Certainly not at that point. Now, there's a section where he does something that's very moving in a tribute memorial, which is silence. He again he goes back to that simple Russian folk-like setting. He uses it often just for the two strings and in four-part writing, like a homework assignment, in honor of Tchaikovsky. But the silences speak much louder than the music. Why don't we start, how about starting at 27? Okay, great. Thank you for going forward. By the way, the four-part harmony part comes a little bit later, but here it's two parts, and then it opens up into four. The silences, they're amazing. And what you just heard, though, moving into the next variation, we end on F, repeated note, here's the C sharp. And then what happens when the cello comes in the new variation? But we're in D flat. So again, that same note has now been reinterpreted and it's the key. And then a few phrases later, it goes to C sharp minor. So again, he's thinking about the D flat and the C sharp, back and forth. It's what's driving the key changes. In fact, we have to hear, it just becomes the whole point. Let's start tell you what, let's start right where we stopped at that variation. And we'll go a little further because this becomes continually back and forth between D flat major, C sharp minor, and F major. So you feel this obsessive still point, this obsessive rock. Okay, it's very hard to say stop. Really beautiful. Now, we're getting towards the end, and I want you to hear the four-part writing, where he's really writing a chorale, and then interrupting it with a particular harmony. Now, what's interesting about this beautiful section we're going to hear is it says right in the score, you can cut this if you want to. Did you see that? Isn't that amazing? It's such a gorgeous thing. I don't know what he was thinking, but it might be that because the violin and the cello play what looks like simple four-part writing, that does seem to be conjuring a homework assignment, but it's so gorgeous that maybe he was embarrassed later. I don't know. It is incredible. It says author's note. You can excise this. Okay, but I just want to say one thing about this before we hear it. Obsessively, we hear this chord, this cadence. I have to say something about that. It does, instead of being 5-1, doesn't that sound awful right now? You know who hated 5-1? Debussy. He even wrote in a journal that after hearing some music at the Paris exhibition in 1890, all at the same time, that he thought that 1, 4, and 5 chords sounded like they were written for babies. And in some translation, it says written for children. It's probably a better translation, but some of them say babies, even in some important books. Okay, so if you take that chord, 5-7, and you drop the 5th, that's closer. And then if you raise the root, there we are. So it is a permutation of 5-7-1. There is another way that people write about this, if you read this sort of thing. 5-7, flat the 5th. Now it is like whole tones. If you change the position of it, it's another 5-7 with a flatted 5th. So that gives you the right to return it, and it's the same chord again. There's a lot of symmetry here. Different people write about it different ways, but it's the idea that you can go from a to, and you know, it reminds me of if you take this cadence and flat it like that, and use the ninth, it's Satin Doll by Duke Ellington. Even without the ninth. Okay, so let's hear that last passage. You know, can you try something? I know he didn't write this. Can you try it with the mutes on and no vibrato? Let's just see what happens. Same thing.
Right on from tempo.
Let's start from, yeah, right exactly there. You know, maybe he decided to cut it because the 5-1 is what the strings play. They play, you know, yum ba bum 5-1 cadence, and then the piano never goes back to the interesting cadence. So maybe it bothered him. But because it's isolated in terms of instruments, it's like a memory. We got the cadence in the piano, and then we have this distant memory of class. I really think it's a memory of class with the 5 marks. And I could see why he might want to cut it because it's too personal, not because it's not good. It's very interesting. Now I have a few more things I need to say before we hear this piece straight through. By the way, I must have thought of Duke Ellington earlier because here's In a Sentimental Mood, which has that cadence, just a little bit of it. It even has some of the chord progressions. This instead of and this is the ninth. Many tunes by Rachmaninoff were used for popular tunes. I'm sure you know that. What's interesting is at the time, like, you know, when Frank Sinatra sang Full Moon and Empty Arms and there are other ones, All by Myself and some other things that people always said, oh, he's getting even more popular because popular music is using his tunes. But those tunes have basically gone away, and the Rachmaninoff pieces are still there. So it's an interesting thing. In fact, his music is it's the most popular music that maybe there is, because everything else has popularity, but he has not gone away. It's just as popular as it always was. I decided, since he had an argument or a discussion over vodka about royalties with Stravinsky, to check out how much money did Rachmaninoff make. He was at the same level as the biggest pop stars today. And he wasn't a pop star, he was a classical musician. The numbers are that in 1940, he made $2.5 million on a tour, which equates today to $52 million. Okay. I can see why he and Stravinsky got drunk and had that conversation. Now, if you wanted to take this tune and turn it in, this melody here, and turn it into a pop song, you have to put it in 4/4, because it's usually in 3, but not always. You have to answer some of the phrases, but I'm going to use all of the Rachmaninoff cadences that I pointed out and try to give you a pop tune based on it, and I'll send it to Frank Sinatra. There it is. One more time. Okay, now, but who else flatted the fifth, taking this and went? Does this remind you of anyone? Yeah. We just heard that, right? The cello quintet of Schubert, which ends with the chord. That is the flat fifth, which must have caused quite a stir at the time. He threw it in there, and it's wonderful, but it does speak of music that comes much later. Here's a cadence of Bach that doesn't do the same thing, but Bach continually came up with unique things, just constantly. Here's a cadence that's mind-blowing from the Goldberg Variations, very end of one of them. If you just do this, it's not so weird. But spending a moment here is very weird. I won't go into describing that. And now, before we hear this movement, which is quite extensive, a few quotes of Rachmaninoff. An American fan wrote to him in 1932 and said, "What is music?" And he wrote back. Translated, it says, "What is music? It is a quiet moonlit night. It is the rustling of living leaves. It is the distant sound of evening bells. It is what is born from the heart and goes to the heart. It is love. The sister of music is poetry, but her mother is sorrow." I think that's a good place to stop.